welcome to Writing History. Today I've got the great pleasure to be talking to Christine Bell about her novel, No Small Shame. And look, I've got to congratulate you. I'll do my best to write a review today because I've got my desk clean. I've got everything, all my work done, organised. But this book had me thinking on so many different levels. And one of the things I was thinking when I finished the book last night, I've got to thank you. Thank you so much as a reader that you didn't destroy me, because I was so worried about, because I've read, of course you read the back of the book, and Lauren says it's going to have a heartbreaking climax. And I was wondering, what is this climax going to be? And I was so worried about how it's going to end. So thank you so much for not breaking my heart at the end of the story, because it was a very sad ending, but it worked. It worked really well for me as a reader. And so what was the inspiration behind this book, Chris?
Well, I had actually started another novel at the time, but at the same time I was researching my family history, particularly on my mother's side, but I was trying to do the family tree. So, and my great-grandparents immigrated from Ireland to Scotland in 1901, and then in 1912 and 13, they immigrated to Australia. So I was following their journey and investigating the times and the ages and etc. And when they came out to Australia, they went out to live came out to live, I should say, to the Wonthaggi State Coal Mine. And up in Wonthaggi, they have like the State Coal Mine Museum. So just as part of that, out of interest's sake, I went up to the museum to have a look around, and it's sort of done with some reproductions. And I think because I was so heavily entrenched in the family tree, everything resonated, and everywhere I went that day, it was like there was a little voice that was saying, there's a story here, there's a story here.
Yeah.
And I was really excited to come home and actually speak to my mum and find out, well, what was their story, because, what was their life like, etc. Because I really only had birth dates and where they lived, and I'd been looking at the village of Bothwell Hall in Scotland where they came from. But when I spoke to my mum, they didn't really have a story. And I thought, there must be some record of them somewhere, or something that happened. But no, there wasn't. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They flew under the radar, and nothing that momentous happened.
Well, I would dispute that. I think our lives, I think the hidden lives are what is so fascinating. But continue, yes.
There was nothing publicly or nothing momentous that Mum could tell me, but it did lead me into that thought that everybody has a big life in their own sphere, and you don't move from somewhere like Ireland because of the fighting in the Falls Creek Road where they lived in Belfast to Scotland, and then become a coal miner, and then upheave your whole family a decade later and bring them to Australia, unless there's something about you and your family. That's a big thing for people to do. So
amazing.
But it made me think, of the big steps that ordinary people make. And it worried me for a while that my story was going to be too quiet, and that my characters were people that would have lived those quieter lives, and was that going to be enough to interest the reader? But from the moment Mary turned up, because I kept thinking, there is a story there, I just need the character and I just need the story idea. And it began with just thinking of these two characters who knew each other in Scotland, and I knew that when my great-grandparents came out, quite a few people from their village came out too, and they sponsored their families and other families to come out, which is why I wanted the Merrileys and the O'Donnells to come to Australia. but their relationship just grew. And once Mary turned up, I fell in love with the story. I fell in love with the characters, and I fell in love with the era and what was
Yes.
going.
There was so much. I mean, when you think about it, I think she was only 20 when you end the story. So much happened to her in those. I mean, you could write a sequel, because I really would love to know what happens next to their lives. But that first 20 years, so many different things was happening. Migrating from Scotland, all the tragedy, First World War, the plague, I mean, the flu of that time. Yeah, it was and one thing that struck me too when I finished the book, even though we are living through difficult times now, my goodness, the times that Mary lived in, wow, wow, it just made you sort of realize how far we have traveled. Did you feel that when you wrote it?
Very much so, particularly looking back at what they experienced during the Spanish flu, when they obviously had to isolate and wear masks, and also suffer the knowledge that so many people around them were dying, because 15,000 people died in Australia during the Spanish flu, and quite a few died in one thaggy. And they didn't have the benefit of internet and Zoom and television, and we have a lot of distractions that we can embrace, but they were also living such poor lives. They didn't have anything. So, you know, they talk about how our online shopping has increased. They couldn't shop. They couldn't, even a regular day, they couldn't go out and shop to make themselves feel better. So
one thing that struck me as well, because I came from a working class family, and I know the damage that poverty does to people's life and how it carries down the generations. So, you know, that was the thing that was most powerful to me, was that this story was giving voice to those people who were born in such poor lives. And it would have been very hard for you to actually write. It would have been hard as a writer to explore all that, you know, terrible times and terrible lives. I'm feeling like I'm going to burst into tears because I'm thinking about, you know, how Mary's life was shaped and how Liam's life was shaped. And Liam actually reminded me a bit of my father in a sense, you know, because my father could have been so much more in his life. He was a very intelligent man. First, he was a depression child. And he grew up during the Second World War. He was evacuated during the Second World War as an 11-year-old. And the things that happened to him, it reminded me so much of Liam. And so was it hard to write this book?
Yes, but it was hard emotionally at times to go to, because you, as you know, you do step into your character's world and it becomes very real, so you can feel that. But I was fortunate that I did have a lot of access to, you know, there's a lot of local government, municipality that do stories from the past and anthologies and booklets, and you know, I got to read a lot of those type of stories, which really hooked me into it. And I think that I must be the type of writer that can really get into the gritty harshness
you did.
And I mean, some people would never have been able to touch Angela's Ashes. The book Angela's Ashes by Frank, was it Frank Court?
Court, I think.
Court, that's right. But I loved it. And I think that having I think the difference for me was because it was my family background, I was able to step into that a lot more. And just, you know, going into a couple of forums I went to from Belfast that were people talking about what the Falls Road area was like back, you know, in the 50s, etc., really clued me in to what the life would have been like for my great grandparents. But yeah, I find it fascinating. I don't find it as horrifying as I probably should be, but I'd be horrified to live like that.
Yeah.
But I can so imagine the cobblestones that people urinate behind the pub in, and the theatre, and you know, I can still picture my grandmother's in Northcote, her tiny little kitchen and her stove, and there was virtually nothing in that kitchen except a sink and this little stove, and it was so basic that, you know, all those things from your past tend to come into play when you start writing something like that. And I could more easily relate to that life, I think, than perhaps, you know, the Tudors that you write, because that's very different again. But once you start doing the research, you can start to put yourself there. But being in early 1900s, I certainly have the advantage of, you know, there are reproduction houses and many places you can visit, museums and things, to see exactly what they had in those days.
I think what you're just saying actually really does frame one of my questions was, you know, how do writers of history write what we know? Because, of course, you're writing about 1910 to 1920. You weren't born then, long time before you were born, yet you have written about it in a way that brings that period to life by what the things that you have learnt and of the family history that you have and everything like that. So do you want to talk about how we feed what we know into our works?
Yes, certainly. I mean, at the beginning of writing the novel, I was sort of I was a little overwhelmed at one stage, thinking, this is an era I don't know. This is two different countries, as in the island, which is only covered in a very minuscule way, but Scotland had to be covered. So, and I knew nothing about that. I knew Bothwell Hall no longer existed. And there was a world war involved. And there was a point where I thought, oh, am I the right person to write this? This is a big story that involves so much I don't know. And the writing recommendation is always to write what you do know. But I thought, but I want to know about this. But I had to learn everything, you know, the language that they would have spoken, the type of sayings they would have used, the type of food they ate then. And I found it a little bit overwhelming at times too. Every single thing that I said, I had to go and recheck, because it's close enough that you can bring yourself into that world more easily than centuries ago. But everything that happened, there was a lot that happened over those years, particularly between the 80s and the 1880s and the 1920s. You know, did they have matches in those days? How far had electricity gone in Melbourne? Was it in Richmond? Was it in this particular area of Richmond? You know, there was certainly plumbed water and electricity in Wonthaggi, which for a small country town was quite unusual. It's only because it was a state-owned town, but it wasn't in certain parts of Wonthaggi, in the newer parts in the north. So there was all sorts of things I had to learn, but I was able to feed in things that I knew, because it's amazing what comes back to you that's said when you're younger, that you don't really take any notice of. And unfortunately, we never think, well, I didn't, and think to ask my grandmother, what was it like to come to Australia? What was it like on the ship? What was it like, you know, coming to live in a tent in someone's backyard? And so all those things I had to learn, but there were different things about the type of attitudes they had. I mean, I can remember my mother talking about, oh, your grandmother would be hurling the poker if you did that, you know. And my grandmother always used to say how, you know, my grandmother would walk around the house wielding the poker, and if you didn't do what you were told, you were threatened with it.
Yeah.
And all those things tend to come back to you and feed
Yes.
into your work.
Yes. I loved your dialogue. I thought it was pitched perfectly. Must be part of your DNA. But did you how did you was it easy for you to recreate that dialogue? You did a
In some way
fantastic job.
it was, because I will admit that when Mary did turn up, she turned up complete, I would say, a Scottish accent, though I did do a little pitch a few years ago to say what I was writing, and there was a Scottish lady there, and she said, I think you're more Irish than Scottish. I said, oh, okay. But I think that because I had that from both my,
Yeah.
you know, my father's parents came from Ireland too. So I think that it all sort of merged in. But when Mary turned up with this accent, it was just easy to write. And I wrote for years, or not years, but I wrote in the beginning years of that manuscript with that accent. And it was only, and I used to read it like that at writing group, and everybody loved it. But there came a point a couple of years ago that I went, you know, I must not read with an accent, because the reader won't read with an accent. So I have to make sure that the rhythm of the sentences are going to work for the reader who's not reading with a Scottish accent. But I did have a few little things, especially when it came to editing, that my editor tried to fix my unwieldy syntax in my sentences.
Yeah.
So, but I was lucky that my the editorial director had said to me, we don't want to lose the voice, so you feel free to say what you want left in and what you don't. So if there was a sentence that she thought was particularly complicated, I did look at changing it slightly to make it easier for the reader, to lighten the reader's cognitive load, as she put it. And I think that did help. And because I wanted the reader to just get into it and not become overly conscious of the language. But yeah, I was fairly persistent that I wanted it to be the way that read right to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the end, I wasn't sure whether it was correct for Scottish or Irish. And, you know, I have that, both that impact and both that influence from my ancestors. So I don't know how much is real, but I also know that certain things my mother said and my grandmother said are in there. But once I was really into the voice of Mary, sometimes I would write something and I would think, where did that come from?
Yes.
Where did that come from?
This is one of my theories is that we carry our ancestors in our DNA. And yes, I think that's what's happened with you, is that you've been able to do the voice because it's part of your DNA. I know also you've heard it with your mother and your grandmother, and so it's there as part of your writerly compost. And you know, it's so great that you were able to draw it out for this great story. What writing influences have you had? I mean, it did make me think of Ruth's, was it Oranges and Lemons? Ruth Parks. Yeah.
I love Ruth Parks' writing. And I think that if I was to say what it was most like, I think it really is similar to Harp in the South.
Yeah.
And it has that feel that coming from a place of poverty and more drama in the household, etc. And I think probably it's along a similar style. I just wanted to make sure that it really resonated the era. And I did have people at times say to me that I needed to make Mary more feisty. I needed to make her more her own woman. But I wanted to keep it firmly.
Yeah, but she's only so young. I mean, she did become her own woman at the end, which was wonderful.
To grow into that.
Yes, exactly.
And she was coming from a home of poverty, strict Catholic upbringing. She was only 16, and it was certainly of a time where kids should be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was a young woman in her 20s that had some type of influences out there that could actually help her. And I wanted to show that for ordinary women, they just didn't decide they wanted a voice. They didn't decide they wanted happiness. They couldn't just decide to do whatever they wanted. That's not the way it worked in those days.
No, it was very, very, very sad for people in that period of time. Life was desperation, and it was very bleak, and the choices open to that time to those people were nothing. My father used to say, "You're born poor, you die poor," and that was he really believed that. Yeah. So yeah, it's and also with Mary, because the story ends when she was just 20. Thinking about my mother in the 50s before she was married. My grandmother used to lock her out if she didn't get home in time. She got home too late. I think it was 11 o'clock. She would be locked out of the house, and she would have to be out of the house begging her mother to be let in. So yes, and she was in her late 20s at that stage. So and she had served as a WAF during the Second World War, so she had that time of being independent, and she actually came out of the WAFs as almost a sergeant. So, but when she returned to her mother's house, she had to do what her mother told her, live by the rules.
And it was very much like that. And I did have someone say, a publisher actually, that it was sent to in early submission, that couldn't understand why Mary would tolerate her mother treating her like that. Well, it wasn't a matter of tolerating. Where else would she go?
Yeah.
There was no living away from home allowance or anything like that. She had no choice but to toe the line. That was the choice. And in those days, many young women, when they became pregnant, they were disowned and sent off or forced to give up the baby. So even though more is harsh, for the day, she wasn't nearly as harsh as some.
Exactly. No, I understood completely that story, because it's so many stories in your lovely novel came from my own family history. That's, the thing is that I really, really related to this book, because I could see my father, my grandmother. My grandmother was Mary's mother. Because she had such terrible things happen to her. She was never a happy woman. I can't remember her smiling once. Life was very serious, and yeah. Anyway, so you've gone from writing for children, and this is your first book for adults. Mm-hmm. Is there different things that you have to keep in mind for writing for children, writing for adults, or did you find the journey from going from one type of writer to another type of writer easy?
No. It was a very big learning curve, because when I did professional writing and editing, I did write a YA novel, which was quite a gritty story. But my kids' short fiction, it's very short, but it's more fun. It's adventure, or it was fun. It's very different writing, that you have to be very succinct with children's writing. You have to get to the point, not waffle around. I loved writing for children, don't get me wrong, but it was interesting as I was writing that the older my children got, the older my characters got. And that tended to just keep going like that. But to write a book like No Small Shame, where you've got it's spread over 10 years from the very first scene to the last scene, 2 continents, a world war, an immigration. It's just, it was a huge thing compared to something that's very tightly confined in a few thousand words. So I think that's why it probably did take quite the length of time it did to write, because initially when I first thought it was finished, it was finished a bit earlier, but I had to learn to balance everybody's story, because I really tried to make it that everybody had a story, and that every character had a backstory, and every character had a presence when they were there. So that was big to do and to weave in. And because I didn't plan it, I'm usually the type of person who's much more organised and planner, but with No Small Shame, I did write it very organically. And I started off, I knew that I had Mary and Liam come to Australia, but when Mary got to Australia, Liam would reject her, but she would become pregnant. Beyond that, I did not know what was going to happen. So I had to write my way into the story, and then the story had to develop from there. So I did go down off on a few tangents. I had a lot of words that are not in the book that were there originally. Other characters explored, but it took time for me to realise how important more was to the story. And I had concerns for quite a while, because I had 2 climaxes, and I was worried about that. I thought, oh, that's wrong. You just have to come to one central climax. Everybody's story has to be wrapped up. But I knew that I had 2 climaxes, the one with him and then the one with more. So it was a big learning curve, but it really did help that I had some good advice within writing the story. But I'm not sorry now that it took so long to write, because
so how long was that so long?
Well, to write it, if I worked out the other day, it probably took me about 5.5 years to actually write it, because I did have breaks in between, because I wrote a YA novel and started 2 others in the meantime, because I felt that it was so close to finished, but I knew that it wasn't saying exactly what I wanted it to say. And it took me time to really be able to tease out more of the relationship between Moore and Mary, and to make it so that Mary could really come to understand her mother as well. And I wanted the reader to understand too, because even though Moore is very harsh, I wanted it to be clear why a person becomes the way they are, exploring the complexities of people's motivations and choices, and how even the ones that they make when they're young can sometimes resonate so many years later. And it was actually by finding a lot of the little guns on the wall that I'd already planted in the book that ultimately led me to some of those revelations at the end.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's, and you were talking about the people that helped you along. So you've got writing groups. Is that, yep? You
Two
want to talk
writing
about that?
groups.
Yep. You want to talk about how helpful that is to a writer to have critical friends? That's what we
I think
call them.
particularly valuable for this first book because they help buoy you up when
Yep.
you lose your confidence or you're not sure which way to go. They can really, they're great sounding boards.
Mm. Yep.
And I find mine invaluable. I've been in both groups over 10 years, and now they're all published writers. But some of us, it's just come as we've gone on. I mean, I had lots of short kids fiction published, but not a novel. But yeah, I think they're great for tissues and wine, but they're also, it's great to have, some of those things that the questions they ask you that make you face something in the novel that you might have been glossing over, and then it makes you really consider issues, or they give you food for thought, if nothing else, because people can give you great feedback and be positive about your writing, but it's the making you address different things which is incredibly valuable,
Oh yeah, that's for sure.
because it makes you question things, because I never just take advice, oh okay, that's what I should do. I do interrogate it to make sure, is that going to work for my story? And sometimes it won't.
Mm.
But definitely those conversations you then have with yourself, interrogating your work, led me on to come up with other ideas if that
Yeah.
wasn't working, or it sparked something that I thought, oh yes, that's important to know, and that needs to go back, right back at the beginning. That needs to be fed in there.
Yeah. You just gave a good example of the deep thinking we need to do as writers, and that's part of the craft of being a writer. Would like to talk about your writing day? How do you write? Do you have a particular time that you like to write, or do you have a day that you allocate to writing?
I tend to be at the desk every day.
Yep.
I try these days to give myself Saturdays and Sundays off, even if I'm doing something, but not making it a writing day. I learnt the hard way that, one must have hobbies. One must do something other than writing. So my writing day is pretty much, I like to get to the desk early, cup of tea in hand, and I usually will read over what I'd done the previous day. I try to be careful not to go back far, but only what I wrote the day before, because otherwise I can get very sidetracked in editing and forget to get on and do something. But once I start writing, I tend to just focus on that scene. Though historical is so tempting to go off and, oh, I better check that. And some days I can be really disciplined and put it in red on the manuscript, check this, check that. And other times I will disappear down the rabbit hole of Google, but or have to go and read something. But I'm pretty disciplined these days.
Yeah.
I think it comes from, years of working and then only having a certain amount of writing time. I found that I was more productive probably in those days. Now it is easier to get sidetracked and particularly with research and reading.
Yeah, I agree. I find when I look back on my earlier years of being a writer with 3 kids, this is before David was born, I was definitely doing far, far more writing than I do now. But then I've got other things that's part of my my life, which is teaching, obviously, and I also have learnt about the fact that you do need to have that balance. Your family is part of your life, and you need to take notice of your family. David's here and probably thinking, oh. But yeah, I think it's as you get older, you realise that what is really important in life too. Or that's what I've come to see. You know, the family is truly my core. Writing is really important to me, but it's you've got to find that balance.
And you need other things to feed in.
Yeah, you got to live a life to write
all the time. Yes.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So you are writing a new project. I gather from what you're saying here. So you want to talk about? Do you want to just? Are you comfortable to talk about your new project?
Well, I probably won't say too much about the actual story, but it is set in the similar era. It is the year to 18 months after the war, but it's the story of an Australian soldier and his choice to stay on in France after the war ends, and the basis of the story is the traumatic reason why he can't go home, and it's the exploration of that and his war experience. But yeah, so I really it's a bit too soon to say too much about it, but it has meant a lot of research too. And sadly, my research trip that I'm supposed to be going on in 2 weeks has now been cancelled, and because I was supposed to go to France to do some groundwork, because I find that walking the ground of setting is really, really important. I know it made a big difference to No Small Shame. And so that's disappointing, but it's up to, I'm well into the second draft, and I'm really pleased with how the story's developing. And yeah, same thing though. I want to imbue this book with the same level of complexity of character that I've got in No Small Shame. So I'd love to say that it'll be finished next year. I don't know that.
No, novel is finished when it's finished. It's got its own time, you know. And we can never predict when that's going to be finished. This is what I've found, according to my experience. No, you can't put a time span on it. You like to.
Just at that stage where the main characters are coming into their own and starting to react and make choices, and I know what they will be because of the type of people they are. And that takes time to get to. With when writing a novel, they, you know, you can make them do things, but they're now at the point where they're doing what they're supposed to do, what they would do.
And is your character inspired by any historical soldier that you know of, or you've made it? Oh, that's lovely. That's come from your imagination.
There is one part of it that was in the Australian Army, that there's some people there that are real. So yes, I'm just negotiating that. How many words can you put in a real person's mouth? But so I'm having to be careful with that. But it really is very much Hugo's story and how his past has affected his present. That's something that I do find fascinating, you know, and I think I did a fabulous workshop masterclass a few years ago with Michael Hogg, and he very much talks about how the wound from a person's past affects their identity in the future. And so that's something that I really am looking at closely with these characters. But I'm having a lot of fun with it. But there is an aspect of it which is very grim and painful. And because of the type of research I'm having to do into World War One, it's at the nitty-gritty side of it, with the battles and the effects on soldiers, particularly shell shock. And
yeah, but
their
you
survival.
did a fantastic job of that in No Small Shame. As a writer, what do you hope your reader will get out of your books? Because I can see the messages that I'm getting out of it, but I'm a reader, and this is the thing, is that when you know that when you hand a book over to a reader, then it takes on another life through that person's reading experience. So what are you, as a writer, hoping your readers will get out of your novels?
Well, No Small Shame particularly, I want the reader to come away, particularly younger women readers, with a greater understanding and appreciation of why things are the way they are for women. And, you know, I did wonder if young women sometimes thought, why the hell have our parents, our mothers and grandmothers put up with this? Why didn't they fix this? And I wanted them to be able to see what the inequality and restrictions and constrictions that their mothers and their grandmothers and their great grandmothers faced up to, and why it wasn't a matter of just saying, I'm not putting up with this. The small steps that women had to make in order to gain agency and a voice. And I think, you know, that was important to me, to show that. And the only way I could do that was to show an ordinary person. And the more I wrote it, the more important that became to me. On the other side of the coin, it was a worry to me, would the book be too quiet for the average reader? Because it's not this. There's a lot happening, of course, but Mary's not going, okay, and I'm changing this and I'm changing that. She's not a feisty heroine, but I wanted to show that quiet, ordinary women can be very strong and powerful in their own way. And they were the type of women who made even more inroads.
Yeah, exactly.
To, you know, the steps women made. So, yeah, it took me a long time to actually realise, yes, this is important. It's important to show what ordinary women do and their lives, because they are the women that paved the way for us.
Yeah. I saw Mary as being a heroine. I saw Mary as being very strong. She was so young when everything was happening to her. So many terrible things happened in her life, starting from Scotland. And she survived. She's a survivor, and that's all we can hope.
Stoic. Those women were so stoic. My mother read the beginning of the book, the very first draft beginning, I think about 60,000 words before she died. And she said to me, this isn't supposed to be Mary McConaughey, is it? Nellie. No, it's a made-up character. She said, well, just as well, because your grandmother was laughing all the time and she had such a sense of humour. But my great-grandmother, she gave birth to 8 children, and 5 of those babies died. And as I was writing it, No Small Shame, I wondered, am I making it too grim for the reader with all this death and babies dying? But that is the way it was, particularly all Catholic women. They did lose a lot of children. So, I mean, even my grandmother, she lost 2 more babies after they did come out from one baby. But I have no doubt that part of their reason for wanting to immigrate was because they were living in a mining village where so many children and wives and people died of pneumonia and diphtheria and all sorts of
Yeah.
diseases.
Yeah.
So, but they were stoic women, and they did come back, and they did have senses of humour, despite the fact that, I would think, how did you get through that? How did
Yeah.
you survive all that heartbreak?
Yeah. I know. I feel the same way when I look back on my family history too. My great grandmother, I followed her trail. What was her great? I don't know. My gold mine. One of my ancestors got the gold bug and took his family from Williamstown to Ballarat. Their first child died in Ballarat. When we were following their trail, she had 12 children, and of those children, 6 died. And that was because they were living a hard life going around the gold fields, I assume. But, it was just like another child's grave. Oh. How do you survive that? How do you keep sane? You just feel so proud of them, that these were courageous people who did survive these horrible times, heartbreaking times. Yeah. And he actually, her husband died in his early 40s, and she remarried again, had more children. Anyway, she was brave. All right, so we've got a reading. That would be lovely if we could have the reading. That would be fantastic.
Yes, certainly. This is an extract, not quite halfway through, after Mary becomes pregnant out of wedlock and her mother banishes her to her friend Winnie's farm. And I love how this scene shows both the naivety and wisdom of the women of the early 1900s, and shows how much we had to learn about many things and how far we've come. Oops. In friendship's name, mid-September 1915. Mary, are you in there? Mary glanced up at the back of the wash house door and tugged the worn flannel floating in the 3 inches of bathwater permitted in the tin tub up over her chest, knowing it too miserly to cover anything but her bosoms. She sighed and called out, "Yes, Winnie, but don't come in. I'm in the bath. I won't be long." Her voice echoed off the corrugated iron walls. She lay back in no rush to get out after it had taken 2 weeks to get Sloy to spare enough water for a bath, and him ranting at her, "There's a bloody drought on, don't you know?" She couldn't believe it then, the next second, when the door handle turned anyway, and in burst Winnie. "Please, Mary, I need to talk to you. It can't wait." Winnie closed the door on a giggle. "No one can see you except me. Frank's out in the barn, primping his prize porkers. Besides, ain't we both girls and best bosom friends?" "Yes, but there's certain things even friends don't share." Mary frowned. Checking the flannel covered her scars, more disturbed Winnie might see them than any place more personal. Her cheeks pinked, recalling her nights of worry over how she could ever show her husband something so ugly, never dreaming she needn't have worried, or that he would not care to look. "Oh, Mary, you look lovely being pregnant and all round and soft, not a bit like scrawny old me." "Winnie, don't say that. I'm sure you look no different from me." Embarrassed under the girl's awestruck gaze, Mary swapped the flannel for a towel hanging on a nail in the wash-house wall and began to heave herself up by the sides of the tub. Yes, I do look different. That's what I want to talk to you about." Winnie stepped up close to the tub, wringing her hands and making no show of keeping her eyes to herself. "Mary, if you let me see something of yours, I'll show you something of mine." "What in God's name are you talking about, Winnie? Have you gone gilhooly mad? I've got to get dried and dressed before I catch my death." But how could she when Winnie began to bawl, her words tangling in her tears? "Mary, I know I sound potty, but I'm that worried. Look at me." Before Mary could stop her, Winnie began unbuttoning her blouse and slipping her arms out of the sleeves. She tugged her chemise over her head, revealing no further underwear, only her bare breasts, skinny, flat little things with nipples as dark as prunes. Their lack of plumpness for Winnie's time caused Mary's brow to crease. See, I told you there's something wrong with me, ain't there? And look, Winnie pulled her skirt down over her belly. Look there, that horrid line. What's wrong with me? Mary towed herself off, choosing her words carefully, sensing this another important talk missing from Winnie's life. How to explain that the purplish-brown line from her navel to down there only evidence that her babe was near to coming. There's nothing wrong, Goosey Lucy. You're as normal as the sun rising in the east. You're having a baby is all. She ran her hand then gently over the bulge of Winnie's belly and carrying a very neat package. The line down there is quite normal. Lots of women expecting have it. You don't, Winnie shot back, her lip wobbling. Frank says it's a sign. Something's wrong with me. Oh, Winnie, that's not true, Mary soothed. Mrs. Merrilies had the exact same line. Quickly she bit her tongue to stop from saying anything further about Mrs. Merrilies, but really she could strangle Sloy, him and his lies. Look at me bosoms then. A girl's supposed to get big bosoms when she's having a baby. Frank was expecting them too. He says mine are no bigger than me sponge cakes and likely to go flatter after the baby's born. For a moment, Mary wanted to march out of the wash house, find Frank Sloy and punch him hard on the nose for treating Winnie worse than his pigs. Except it was becoming clearer by the day Winnie had more need of her than doing housework alone. Winnie, I will show you something of mine. Ain't none of us perfect, see? Mary closed her eyes before pulling open the towel to reveal the scarring on her breasts to Winnie's horrified gasp. Lordy, Mary, what happened to you? While Mary explained the overheated poultice, she stepped into her knickers and tugged on her chemise and half-buttoned blouse. Then she pulled Winnie into her arms and hugged her fiercely, before holding her apart to gaze solemnly into her face. You are beautiful, Winnie. You're having a baby is all. Some women have lines on their bellies and small bosoms. It don't mean anything is wrong, and only an ignorant person would say other. Now dry your tears and let's go for a walk while I dry my hair. We'll pick some pretty wildflowers to cheer us up and the house a bit. Then I'll make you a lovely cup of tea. She wiped the last of Winnie's tears from her cheeks. Thank you for showing me your awful scars, Winnie gulped. I feel better for seeing them. I don't know what I'd do without you as my friend and come to live with me, Mary. No, Winnie, let's be clear. I have to go back home soon and see if my husband has written to me yet. Inwardly she sighed, glad to have Liam as her excuse to leave at least. Well, I hope your husband never writes, sulked Winnie, because I'm never going to let you leave.
Well done, well done. That was a very, very, I mean, the whole book is so alive, but that scene was really great. And a good choice to do a reading on too. Yeah. Have you got any, before we end, have you got any advice for us aspiring writers?
Well, the age-old one, persistence, it really does pay off. It does. Believe in your writing. And I think to help fuel that belief, it's important to enter competitions and try out for things so that those little milestones help fuel your belief and your enthusiasm and give you inspiration to go on. There's two things that I learned during my professional writing that I think really helped my writing. It's not just the read, which is ultra important for any writer, but to read your work aloud.
Yeah.
I remember being told if you read your work aloud, you learn to recognize rhythm in your sentences.
Yes.
And that took me a long time to get. I used to think, what does that mean? What does that mean? But to get a certain rhythm and cadence in your sentences, that's when your work starts to sing. And unless you read it out loud, you can't learn it because you can't recognize that it's much flatter on the page. But if you can make, even though people don't read books aloud usually, if you can do that, it will come out on the page and bring it to life. So that was the one important thing. And the other one I was taught was to pick your similes to match your story. And by that, it came home to me when I was writing No Small Shame. There's a scene in there where Liam has the nightmare, and he virtually attacks Mary in that scene.
Yep.
When I first wrote that, I wrote it as if she was drowning and the boat she was on was going under and the waves crashing over. And that was the type of metaphor and simile I was going for. But I had to then think, no, that's not what the book's about. It's about mining. And then all of a sudden it came to me, the feeling of being underground when a mine starts to cave in and things crashing down and you can't escape. And once I rewrote that scene with that as Mary's feeling while she was Liam grabbed her after his nightmare, that really, I think, made that scene pop more and made it resonate so much with the rest of the book. And so that is really important to, you know, look at your similes to see they don't all have to reflect it, but they should be in the tone and work with your story, not just be something obscure out there that's a great simile but doesn't work with your book.
Yeah,
or your
that's
story.
Fantastic advice. Absolutely fantastic advice, Chris. Now I'll have to go through the book and but it is true that makes the whole work in a sense. A novel can be a metaphor, and by doing what you just suggest, that actually makes that your novel into that metaphor more. So yeah. And it's also shows the amount of thinking that as writers that we need to do when we craft our work. It's once we get our first draft down, we're not finished. We're not a long way from finished. There's another mountain climb of the second draft and then the third draft, and oh my goodness. And all the things that we cut and delete along the way. Yeah, it's
But it's never wasted, is it? Because it informs you on where the story really should be, even though I look at all those folders of thousands of words that never went in, and but they all lead you to the point of getting your story exactly where it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And also I think it really helps you learning craft, because you're writing so much more and you really get to know your characters so much more by writing scenes that show how they would have reacted to different situations and events. And sometimes you might lose that whole scene, but there's just an idea from that scene that's really poignant that can be included in your book, isn't it? So
exactly.
Never wasted.
Never wasted at all. It's just part of being a writer and honing and polishing our craft. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this has been a lovely chat, and I'm looking forward to reading your second book. And I'm now going to go and start drafting out your review, which I'm hoping to finish today. I'm going to be good now that I've got an empty desk. I'm going to do your review and and Kate's review, which I've started to write but haven't finished yet. So, and we'll catch up. And I'm looking forward to catching up face to face in the near future. That would be lovely. That would be lovely. Look after you.
Not too long.
Oh, hopefully this 4 more weeks. Is it 4 more weeks before we can emerge back into the world?
Well, it's a good excuse to write. I've set myself some really solid work to do during this time. It's a good excuse to work.
Exactly. We've got to keep busy. We've got to keep busy.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all, darling. I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.